Trump just declared total victory. But what if the story is exactly the opposite? Less than 2 hours before a deadline he himself called final, less than 2 hours before he threatened to make a whole civilization die, Donald Trump blinked. He called it a win. He posted on Truth Social that the U.S. had already met and exceeded all military objectives. He said it was an honor to have this long-term problem close to resolution. And in Tehran, people poured into the streets. But they were not weeping in defeat. They were celebrating. That single image tells you everything you need to know about this deal. Both sides cannot be winners, and yet here we are. So let us do something unusual. Let us actually look at what this agreement says. Let us look at what Iran got, what the US got, and why the gap between those two lists should concern every American who followed this war. Because what is emerging from the wreckage of 6 weeks of conflict is not a clear American victory. It is something far more complicated, far more fragile, and, depending on how the next 2 weeks unfold in Islamabad, potentially a turning point in Middle Eastern history that cuts in a very different direction than the one Trump described. Stay with us. By the end of this video, you will understand what actually happened on April 8, 2026. Not the spin, not the press conference, the actual architecture of this deal, point by point. Let us start from the beginning. The war began on February 28, 2026. The United States and Israel launched a joint military offensive against Iran. The stated goals were unambiguous: eliminate Iran as a regional threat, prevent Tehran from developing a nuclear weapon, and dismantle the network of proxy forces that had destabilized the Middle East for decades. Those were the objectives Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu laid out publicly. 6 weeks later, after sustained American and Israeli airstrikes, after Iran fired back across the Gulf, after Bahrain sounded air raid sirens, after Saudi Arabia intercepted 7 ballistic missiles headed toward its eastern energy facilities, after a U.S. F-15 was shot down over Iranian territory and its crew had to be rescued, after all of that, the United States agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. The formal operation was called Operation Epic Fury, and right up until Tuesday evening, the White House was insisting it was still ongoing. As a White House official told AFP just hours before the deal, "This is one of many ideas, and the president has not signed off on it. Operation Epic Fury continues." And then, less than 2 hours before the 8 p.m. Eastern deadline Trump had called final, everything changed. Here is the critical question. What did the United States actually agree to? And here is where it gets truly remarkable. Iran's Supreme National Security Council issued a statement calling the ceasefire an enduring defeat for Washington. Those are their words. Their top security body declared, and I am paraphrasing carefully here, that it had achieved a great victory and compelled the United States to accept its 10-point plan. The council added that its finger remains on the trigger and that any deviation by the enemy would be met with full force. This is not the language of a nation that has been defeated. So what is actually in this 10-point plan? Let us go through it, because this is the core of everything. According to reporting from Al Jazeera, NPR, Foreign Policy, CNBC, and multiple Iranian state media outlets, Iran's 10-point plan demands the following. First, a U.S. commitment to non-aggression, a formal guarantee that Washington will not take further military action against Iran. Second, Iranian continued control over the Strait of Hormuz. Third, official recognition of Iran's right to enrich uranium. Fourth, the lifting of all primary and secondary sanctions against Iran. Fifth, the release of all Iranian assets frozen abroad. Sixth, termination of all UN Security Council resolutions against Iran. Seventh, payment of war reparations to Iran for damages caused during the conflict. Eighth, the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from all military bases in the region. Ninth, a ceasefire in Lebanon and a halt to strikes against Iran's regional proxy forces. And 10th, a binding framework secured by a UN resolution. Let that sink in for a moment. According to Iran's Supreme National Security Council, the United States has accepted the general framework of these demands as a basis for negotiation. Trump called it a workable basis on which to negotiate. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, told reporters simply that President Trump's words speak for themselves. And what did Trump say? He said almost all of the various points of past contention have been agreed to between the United States and Iran. Almost all. Think about that phrase. The war was launched to eliminate Iran's nuclear program, and the 10-point plan Iran put on the table explicitly preserves Iran's right to enrich uranium. If Trump accepted the general framework of that plan, then the central military objective of the entire 6-week campaign has not been achieved. It has been negotiated away. Now, the White House disputes the Iranian version of events. After Iran's Supreme National Security Council published its statement, CNN reported on the Iranian claims. Trump responded by launching an investigation into CNN. He called the statement a fraud. He said it came from a fake news site in Nigeria, which CNN directly and explicitly denied. CNN said the statement was obtained directly from known Iranian officials and reported by multiple Iranian state media outlets. This contradiction is itself a story. Two governments are telling opposite stories about what was agreed. And that gap, that stunning gap between the Iranian account and the American account, is precisely what makes this deal so fragile and so consequential. We will come back to that contradiction in a moment. But first, let us look at how we got here. Because the path to this ceasefire reveals something important about how Trump conducts foreign policy under pressure. The war has now run for more than 5 weeks. Throughout that period, Trump repeatedly set deadlines, then extended them. He threatened to bomb Iran back to the Stone Ages. He threatened complete demolition of every bridge and every power plant within 4 hours. He described himself as having a plan to decimate every bridge in Iran by midnight. And then, on Sunday, April 6th, he told reporters the Tuesday 8 p.m. deadline was final. He was highly unlikely to extend it. Iran had had plenty of time. Iran's military called his warnings delusional. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said he was ready to die for his country. 14 million Iranians reportedly registered to form human chains around power plants and critical infrastructure. The mood in Tehran was described by correspondents as bleak but defiant. And throughout this buildup, Iran was not sitting still diplomatically. Tehran rejected a 45-day ceasefire proposal floated by Egyptian, Pakistani, and Turkish mediators. The Iranian diplomatic mission in Cairo was explicit. They would not merely accept a ceasefire. They wanted an end to the war, with guarantees against future attacks. This is a crucial distinction. A ceasefire and an end to the war are fundamentally different things. A ceasefire is a pause. An end to the war is a settlement. Iran was holding out for the settlement. And Tehran had calculated, apparently correctly, that the U.S. was not prepared to actually execute the full-scale infrastructure strikes Trump had described.
And here is where it gets interesting. On April 7, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Pakistan's military chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir, reached out directly to Trump. They asked him to extend the deadline by 2 weeks to allow diplomacy to advance. They also asked Iran to reopen the strait for that same period. Pakistan had been serving as the primary intermediary throughout this crisis. Trump agreed. He framed it entirely as a military success. He said the U.S. had already met and exceeded all military objectives. He pointed to the rescue of 2 American crew members from the downed F-15. He referenced weeks of sustained strikes on Iran's military capabilities, its leadership, and its nuclear program. But here is what he did not say. He did not say Iran had surrendered. He did not say Iran had agreed to halt uranium enrichment. He did not say Iran's proxy networks in Lebanon, Iraq, or Yemen were being disbanded.
He did not announce the terms of the final settlement. He announced 2 weeks of talks in Islamabad, starting April 10th. And Iran, in the same hour, announced a historic and crushing defeat for the United States. Now, let us talk about what this moment actually represents strategically, because this is the part that most mainstream coverage is not fully processing. The United States and Israel launched this war with a maximalist set of objectives: regime elimination of the nuclear threat, dismantlement of proxy networks, normalization with Israel as an end state. Those were the stated goals. The 15-point U.S. plan that had been circulating before the ceasefire, which Iran had called largely excessive, unrealistic, and unreasonable, reportedly included Iran committing to no nuclear weapons, handing over highly enriched uranium, accepting limits on its defense capabilities, ending regional proxy groups, reopening Hormuz, and even acknowledging Israel's right to exist. None of those demands appear in Iran's 10-point counterproposal. Not one of them. What Iran's plan does is something structurally opposite. It asks the U.S. to withdraw from the region, lift all sanctions, recognize Iranian enrichment, pay reparations, and accept Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz. Foreign Policy magazine noted that the 10-point plan does not address key issues the U.S. launched the war over in the first place. It seems unlikely, they wrote, that the United States would agree to such demands, raising questions as to why Trump framed the proposal in such positive terms. That is a diplomatic way of asking a pointed question. Why did Trump say almost all points have been agreed to if the plan contained terms the U.S. would never accept? We will come back to that. But first, let us look at what the markets told us, because financial markets have a way of cutting through the noise with brutal clarity. When the ceasefire was announced, oil prices dropped more than 15% almost immediately. U.S. stock futures edged up. On the surface, that looked like a victory signal. Investors do not like war. They hate the kind of sustained oil disruption the Hormuz blockade was generating. So yes, markets celebrated the pause. But listen to what CNBC reported in the days before the ceasefire. Investors and markets were explicitly preparing for two opposite scenarios. Not one outcome with varying degrees, but two completely different directions for the world. That is not confidence in one side's victory. That is a market pricing in genuine strategic uncertainty. And that uncertainty did not go away on April 8th. What the markets are pricing in now is a 2-week window. What happens in those 2 weeks, in those Islamabad negotiations, will determine whether this ceasefire becomes a real settlement or whether it collapses back into conflict. Let us now address the nuclear question directly, because this is the deepest issue buried inside this deal. Iran's 10-point plan explicitly includes recognition of Iran's right to enrich uranium. According to Iranian state media, the U.S. Supreme National Security Council statement said the U.S. had, in principle, agreed to accept Iran's nuclear enrichment. Trump launched an investigation into CNN for reporting that claim. He said it was a fraud. But CNN pointed out that Iran's own embassy in India posted a breakdown of the 10 points on its verified X account, including acceptance of enrichment. The White House did not provide a line-by-line refutation of Iran's claims. Trump himself told AFP that Iran's uranium would be, quote, perfectly taken care of, or I wouldn't have settled. That is an extremely ambiguous statement. It does not say enrichment has been blocked. It does not say the centrifuges have been dismantled. It says Trump believes it will be taken care of. Meanwhile, The Guardian had reported in late March that Trump's 15-point plan was unlikely to appease Tehran, and it proved correct. Because what emerged from the ceasefire is not the 15-point plan. What emerged is a framework based on the Iranian 10-point proposal. And here is the broader strategic context that cannot be ignored. For 4 decades, the central U.S. strategic objective in relation to Iran's nuclear program was the same: prevention. No enrichment, no path to a bomb. Every administration, Republican and Democrat, maintained that red line in some form. The JCPOA in 2015 was controversial precisely because critics said it allowed too much enrichment capacity to remain. The current ceasefire framework, if Iran's account is accurate, would represent a complete reversal of that position. And there are serious American voices raising this alarm right now. As reported by Common Dreams, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut told CNN, and I am paraphrasing here, that he doubted there was even an actual ceasefire in place amid reports of continued Iranian missile attacks on Israel and the UAE. Murphy pointed to Tehran's claim that Trump had accepted Iran's right to enrichment, the suspension of all sanctions, and Iran's retained missile and drone programs. He called the possibility that Iran now controls the strait cataclysmic for the world. Political analyst Raed Jarrar, advocacy director at Democracy for the Arab World Now, was more blunt, according to Common Dreams. He said that if Iran's version of the terms is accurate, the United States and Israel are facing a truly humiliating defeat. He described a catastrophic war of aggression that killed thousands of civilians, wasted tens of billions of dollars, and triggered what he called the worst global energy crisis in half a century. He noted that in this scenario, Iran kept its enrichment, took over the strait, and the United States agreed to lift sanctions. Now, we must also acknowledge the other side of this argument, because honest analysis requires it. The Trump camp's counter-narrative is coherent, and not without merit. The U.S. military did degrade Iran's military infrastructure significantly over 6 weeks. U.S. and Israeli airstrikes targeted leadership, nuclear sites, and the Revolutionary Guards. The rescue of the F-15 crew was a notable success, and critically, the Strait of Hormuz is set to reopen, at least during the ceasefire period, which is a tangible, concrete economic outcome. Oil prices falling 15% in a day is real money for American consumers and the global economy. Moreover, Trump's defenders argue that the Islamabad negotiations will be where the real terms are hammered out. The 10-point plan is a starting point, not a final agreement. The 2 weeks are not the end. They are an opening of a diplomatic process that did not exist before. And there is a geopolitical argument to be made that preventing a full-scale strike on Iranian civilian infrastructure, bridges, power plants, water treatment facilities, avoided something potentially catastrophic. Legal experts from NPR to the EU had warned that attacking civilian infrastructure without military distinction would constitute war crimes under international law. The European Union had explicitly urged Trump not to commit war crimes as the deadline approached. Stepping back from that brink, whatever the reason, may itself be a form of success. But here is what we cannot avoid. The two accounts of what was agreed cannot both be true. If Iran's Supreme National Security Council is accurately describing the deal, if the U.S. has in principle accepted enrichment, sanctions removal, troop withdrawal, and Iranian Hormuz control, then the war achieved the opposite of its stated objectives. Not a weakened Iran, a legitimized Iran with international recognition, sanctions relief, and control over one of the world's most strategic waterways. If Trump's account is accurate, that the U.S. met its military objectives, that Iran's plan is merely a workable starting point, that the final terms will be negotiated from strength, then we need to see those final terms. We need to see what the Islamabad talks produce. We need to see whether Iran actually dismantles any enrichment capacity, whether U.S. troops actually maintain their regional presence, whether Israel actually stops striking Hezbollah in Lebanon. And on that last point, there is already a contradiction embedded in the ceasefire itself. Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif announced that the ceasefire includes Lebanon. Netanyahu's office explicitly said it does not. Within hours of the deal being announced, these two claims were circulating simultaneously, unresolved. That is not a confidence-inspiring start to a 2-week negotiation. The Lebanese dimension matters for a specific reason. One of the U.S.-Israel war's stated goals was eliminating Iran's proxy network in the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon is the centerpiece of that network. If the ceasefire explicitly covers Lebanon, then Israel is being asked to stop striking Hezbollah. If it does not, then Iran retains the option to have its most powerful proxy continue operating. And if there is a genuine dispute about whether Lebanon is covered, then this ceasefire is already fractured at the edges. This is the situation developing fast. And this is exactly why you need clear, direct analysis rather than talking points. Let us zoom out and ask the macro question. Who won this war? The honest answer, 6 weeks in, is that no one has won it yet. The ceasefire is a pause, not a verdict. The Islamabad negotiations are the real battlefield now. And what those negotiations produce within the next 2 weeks will determine whether April 8th, 2026 is remembered as the day Trump secured peace or the day a maximalist U.S. war ended in a minimalist outcome. Here is what to watch for. Watch the Islamabad negotiations. Watch whether Iran shows up with its 10-point plan as a floor or as a ceiling. Watch whether Trump accepts any form of Iranian enrichment in the final text. Watch whether U.S. forces actually begin withdrawing from regional bases, or whether Trump quietly drops that demand. Watch whether the UN sanctions framework stays intact, or whether a new resolution is passed that lifts the existing architecture. Watch whether Netanyahu goes along with the Lebanon clause, or whether Israeli strikes on Hezbollah restart within days. And watch one more thing. Watch Iran's domestic politics. Iran's Supreme National Security Council declared this week that national unity must be preserved and that the negotiations are an extension of the battlefield. That is not diplomatic language. That is the language of a government that sees itself as having won a round, not as having surrendered. The Council warned that if the enemy's surrender in the field does not translate into a political achievement in the negotiations, they will fight side by side on the battlefield until all the demands of the Iranian nation are met. They use the word surrender to describe the United States. That tells you everything about the psychological architecture of this moment. Iran went into these negotiations believing it has leverage. Whether it actually does, and whether Trump understands how to recapture the initiative in Islamabad, will define the next chapter of this conflict. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply during peacetime. Iran has obstructed it since February 28. The economic damage from that blockade has been staggering. Energy prices spiked globally, supply chains were disrupted across the Gulf, and the International Monetary Fund was already projecting significant downside revisions to global growth forecasts. Getting the strait reopened is worth something real. It is not nothing, but the question is what was paid for it. According to Iran, the price was sanctions relief, nuclear recognition, troop withdrawal, and control of the strait. According to Trump, the price was 2 weeks of diplomacy and a starting framework that still needs to be finalized. Both cannot be true, and in 2 weeks, we will know which version was closer to reality. What we know for certain today, April 8th, 2026, is this. The war started with the U.S. and Israel seeking maximum objectives. The ceasefire was announced less than 2 hours before a self-imposed deadline that Trump had called final. Iran's top security body declared victory and called the U.S.'s agreement to their plan a historic and crushing defeat for Washington. The U.S. launched an investigation into CNN for reporting Iran's account. Both sides are calling it a win. And negotiations begin Friday in Islamabad. That is the situation as it stands. Fragile, unresolved, and loaded with implications for the global oil market, for the Middle East balance of power, for the nuclear non-proliferation framework, and for American credibility in the region. If you want to understand what happens next, if you want analysis that does not pick a side but follows the facts wherever they lead, hit subscribe to stay with us. This situation is developing fast. The Islamabad talks begin in 48 hours. Our next video will break down exactly what both delegations are likely to demand and what a real versus a cosmetic agreement looks like. Hit subscribe now so you do not miss it. We will be watching every development in real time and bringing you analysis that cuts through the narrative before the rest of the media catches up.